Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to both our online and offline audience. My name is Helge Blokkesrud, and I'm a senior researcher here at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs and an associate professor at the University of Oslo. And I have the great pleasure to chair this morning's seminar on COVID-19 conspiracy theories in Putin's Russia. For years, the Kremlin has been promoting conspiracy theories to legitimize its actions. During the COVID-19 pandemic, however, the regime itself became the target of such theories. And in today's seminar, we will explore the shady world of COVID-19 dissenters and how the informational resistance of this community has challenged the Kremlin's political messaging. We have two presenters here today, Ilya Yablokov, who is a lecturer in digital journalism and disinformation at the University of Sheffield, a leading expert on Russian conspiracy theories and conspiracy theories in Russia, and the author of Fortress Russia, Conspiracy Theories in the Post-Soviet World, that came out back in 2018. And our own Natalia Moon-Larsen, senior researcher here at NUPI, who is specializing in research on Russian social media. The two of them will share the presentation. They will go on for about 40 minutes, and then we will have another 40 plus minutes for Q&A. To our online audience, I would ask you to please feel free to start signing up with your questions already now during the presentation, and then I'll open up for discussion once we've heard the presentation of Ilya and Natalia. But now, without further ado, Ilya, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Helge. Thank you so much for having me. Hello, online audience. So since we are in a hybrid mode, just to remind you how strange was that during the time of the pandemic. Certainly the virus changed the way how we work, changed our perception of threats, and showed us pretty grim aspects of the daily life, especially if we change our social, cultural and political circumstances. At the same time, we must remember that kind of the inherent part of the pandemic, of the lockdowns, lifting of lockdowns, introducing lockdowns, was also protests. So when we remember those 2 years of lockdowns and various measures that the governments were introducing to protect the health of citizens, something constantly comes up to mind. Well, it is protests to fight for the freedom, to fight against the limitations of movements, fight all sorts of measures introduced in haste by governments who also try to cope with the new challenge, and all sorts of protests, again, related to COVID-19, unrelated to COVID-19. All those protests basically helped to formulate the challenges, formulate the grievances that the ordinary people around the world experienced and wanted to, in a way, discuss in public. So certainly in the UK, we've got all sorts of COVID-19 protests. When we talk about non-COVID-19 related protests, so certainly Black Lives Matter movement in the US, but also in the US, as you remember, probably the pinnacle of all sorts of COVID-19 related protests was this January 6, 2021 protest in Washington. Yes, that was related to elections, but if you remember, part of the issue and part of the reasoning why people supported Trump and why people came there was, and they held these banners, was stop lockdowns, do not touch us, we are against the complete vaccination. So in many ways, these protests help us understand the grievances, the challenges, the pains that ordinary people suffered during COVID time. And certainly a very essential part of the COVID-19 pandemic was mis and disinformation. Something that was called infodemic in the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic. All sorts of ideas about who created the virus, why it was attacking specific categories, who was behind the creation of the virus, promotion of all sorts of fears. So conspiracy theories really became probably the buzzword of 2020 and partially of 2021. Another interesting thing is that during the lockdowns, during the pandemic, all sorts of conspiracy narratives started to travel around the world. So I was monitoring the Russian social media space, and I saw that some of the traditional for American conspiracy culture, conspiracy theories were extremely quickly popping up in the Russian social media space. So that was actually quite interesting, and the difficult times give birth to the new and peculiar conspiracy theories, like with the protocols of the Elders of Zion at the end of the 90s, beginning of the 20th century, the Great Reset conspiracy theory, just another variant of the global conspiracy of the Golden Billion, the international Jewish conspiracy, etc. So the Great Reset was trying to give the answer. What is the pandemic, who's behind that, and what the elite is actually trying to reach. And funnily enough, when I was looking for illustrations for the Great Reset conspiracy theory, that they came up on Google, right? Those of you who watched the film, very famous film, from 1998, They Live, about the guy who found the sunglasses, put them on, and actually sees the real world that is ruled by aliens and strange creatures who tell you to obey, to consume, and thus to be under control. That's the illustration of the Great Reset. And another interesting thing about this global circulation of conspiracy theories is the fact that uniquely, left-wing and right-wing conspiracy theorists were in many ways united by the fear of the elites. But for the right-wing, it was their own fears, but they were connected with the will of the elite. What kind of elite, it's just up to them to put them under control. So ideally they should be absolutely free and without any jabs or vaccines. For the left-wing, it was also the way how the pandemic was managed. It was also a part of this conspiratorial narrative that it's a corrupt ruling elite that is trying to destroy the world of the ordinary small man. So it is very peculiar that the two absolutely different stratas of conspiratorial cultures around the world found themselves fighting pretty much the same enemy. And that boils down to one very important and defining fact of today's life. There's a very low level of trust into institutions. And institution of expertise, institution of political rule, and all sorts of democracy, they are all, as you know, questioned nowadays. But this is about democratic states. How about authoritarian states? And for the authoritarian states, that pandemic actually was such a great opportunity to increase power. It was such a great opportunity to promote all sorts of measures, to put even a bigger, more stronger grip on power. And what we see now in China, all these protests against COVID-19 limitations, this is precisely the reaction on the grip that Xi Jinping was trying to put on the society. And we see those unprecedented protests. They actually show us something, help us understand how China really works. And so increasing measures, monitoring people's activities, helping to install new apps on cell phones. For authoritarian regimes, it was such a great opportunity to increase the state's presence in life of ordinary men and women. Now, Russia, the authoritarian Russia, is also quite an interesting and peculiar case in many ways. Just to recap, what was supposed to happen in 2020? Mid-January 2020, the federal address to Putin's federal address, and Vladimir Putin announced that he's going to change the constitution, of course, for the further promotion of democracy. Certainly, his idea was to increase his power, to stay in power forever, to change the constitution and stay in power forever. So that was his plan. And according to his agenda in 2020, he was supposed to become even more powerful politician. But COVID changed everything, as we know, and we will briefly cover it later. The Kremlin struggled with the plans to amend the constitution, to run the referendum or not. And eventually they made a decision to run the legislation. And the way how the referendum was organized in June actually showed the capability of the Kremlin. They ran it for 1 week. They allowed voting everywhere in the country, even in the forest, you know, in a jokey way. But it actually showed how much freedom, how much freedom the COVID, the lockdown measures, and all this online voting gives authoritarian leaders in order to rig the election and show that they are actually legitimized politicians. But at the same time, and what makes the Russian case curious, the plans to amend the constitution, the amendment of constitution, and the way how lockdowns were managed showed that something the Kremlin miscalculated, and that was the anger and the protests that were gradually emerging throughout the country in 2020 and peaked in 2021. And those protests are actually at the focus of this research and this paper. So why people started protesting against Kremlin measures? Why the country that is under such a strong control of the Kremlin, when there is so many tools created, media tools created, propaganda tools created to keep the society brainwashed and under control, why it didn't work? So how individuals, how ordinary people reacted to the COVID-19 measures, then to vaccination campaign, and then to the disinformation that included COVID-19 conspiracy theories, but it was related to Ukraine crisis. How the grassroots communities reacted to that, and how Kremlin tried to battle with those communities. So these are the questions that are at the center of our paper. So we decided to look at probably the most popular community of anti-vaxxers on Russian Telegram, the community that was called the COVID-19 resistance, that had at some point 130,000 subscribers, so which made it probably the most populated online community. It was established in January 2021 by the Ukrainian guy called Evgeny, and it was in many ways the channel that aggregated global conspiracy theories about COVID-19, but also aggregated domestic narratives and domestic conspiracy theories about COVID-19. So just a few words why we decided to choose that source. So first of all, as those of you who know how Russian media work, Telegram, although it's a social media, and social media in Russia are also under control, like, for example, VK, the most popular social network, Telegram, is so far free. Yes, it's probably under control. It's probably FSB has a backdoor keys to that, but at least if you want to run your channel and post whatever you want, you can run it. So Telegram works as a messenger, but you can also set up the channel and invite people to read the stuff that you broadcast, right? So this is the media that is independent from the Kremlin. Another thing, and that's probably about Pavel Durov, who's the founder of the channel. He's a libertarian. He believes in all sorts of freedoms. So none of COVID-19 disinformation, misinformation was deleted. So we have access to the data from 2020, 2021, and 2022. We know that COVID-19 resistance is the independent channel set up by an individual that had and has probably now no connections with the Kremlin. So it's a grassroots channel that grew up naturally and, again, aggregated all sorts of conspiracy theories. It showed no support to the government. Just the next slide will be about that. The government tried to impose its agenda on COVID-19 lockdowns, COVID-19 vaccination, and it showed no support to that. As a result, it was actually heavily criticized by the pro-Kremlin media, because that was the channel with so many subscribers, that was the channel that was aggregating anger against the policies that the Kremlin tried to address. Just to kind of, again, to recap, before the Ukraine crisis, COVID-19 was the major issue for the Kremlin. And trying to tackle this issue caused a lot of anger on the side of society, but also a very aggressive response of the pro-government media. Now, lockdown started in Russia on the 25th of March. It was not called lockdown. There was no proper lockdown like in European states or the United States. It was some sort of paid holidays announced by Vladimir Putin. Then, at some point at the end of June, when the referendum to amend the constitution took place, the lockdown measures were cancelled. So everyone could go with certain measures, social distance, etc., go and vote. Then the next wave started, and then the Kremlin, after the successful voting, the Kremlin again introduced lockdown, the so-called lockdown, paid holidays. And on 11th of August, Vladimir Putin announced the invention of Sputnik V, the first ever vaccine against coronavirus. And slowly the rollout of vaccination started in autumn 2020. Then Putin possibly vaccinated himself in March 2021, and that sort of stipulated the wave of vaccinations across Russia. And then when the next wave, the number of casualties from COVID-19 peaked, the government decided to finally introduce QR codes, to introduce proper lockdown limitations for those unvaccinated. That caused the wave of social protest in November and December 2021. And finally, when the war in Ukraine started, we saw the gradual lockdown measures being lifted off, and gradually lockdowns and COVID-19 was simply forgotten. And probably the final thing that raised our attention as scholars of COVID-19, scholars of disinformation, was the story about biolabs in Ukraine. Just to remind you, roughly in the third week of the war in Ukraine, the Russian Ministry of Defense came up with that story that the United States funded biological research in Ukraine aimed at the production of coronaviruses. And the plan of this conspiracy was to destroy Russians, to kill the Russians, with a peculiar way of sending the birds from Ukraine to Russia, thus spreading the disease. So that story, no matter how bizarre it sounds, was actually making rounds both in the Russian pro-government media and globally. The Kremlin invested a lot into the promotion of the biolabs conspiracy theories, all sorts of parliamentary commissions, all sorts of coverage, all sorts of documentaries were released, but surprisingly, very few people picked it up. And so, Natalia, would you like to explain what we've done?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ilya. This is like a two-person show. So, just gonna grab some water. Yes, so I will speak a little bit about our methodologies and the narratives that we have found. So, oh, wrong way, this way? Yes. So we chose to harvest data from COVID resistance group for 3 months. And the first month was March 2021, where Vladimir Putin was vaccinated with some Russian vaccine. He didn't go out with which vaccine it was. And the mass vaccinations in Russia started. Okay, it says so with Sputnik V, but I'm not sure if I agree with that, Ilya. I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry, but okay. So, anyways, the second one was December 2021, when new legislation concerning the use of COVID-19 certificates in Russia was discussed in the State Duma, and in Russian discourse they were referred to as QR codes. And the third month was March 2022, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine and when the story that Ilya mentioned about biolabs in Ukraine was launched. And we used Popsters, social media analytical tool. So I will give you a short overview of the narratives that we found. Try not to bore you with too many details from this table, but if we look at the total row on the bottom there, so basically our data consists of 1,700 posts approximately, and average viewers per post were around to 24,500. And 76% of these posts were about global issues, and 26% were about Russia issues. And for the data from March 2022, we actually coded posts that concerned Ukraine also as a Russian issues, because we were looking for the narrative about biolabs. So it made sense to code Ukraine in that way then, but not for the other 2 months. So from this large pool of data, we selected 120 posts for an in-depth qualitative analysis. And here we selected 40 posts per month. 20 of the posts each month were the most viewed posts, and they included both global and Russian issues. And because we were in particularly interested in internal Russian issues agenda, we chose 20 posts per month systematically on Russia issues. And we read all these posts and viewed all these videos and broke it down into narratives. And we found 5 main topics, which I will introduce now. So the most popular subject in the channel was discussion of vaccines against COVID-19 in 44% of the posts. And the second most popular topic was concerns surrounding restrictions due to the virus. So use of face masks and certificates, states of emergency in Russia, dangers of the disease spread through face mask, etc. And in 10% of the posts, the main topic was that claiming that COVID-19 is fake and does not exist. And additional 6% were about domestic Russian issues. And finally, 4% of the posts presented Russia as a besieged nation attacked by external enemies. So I will now give you a short and hopefully fun account of these narratives. So, narrative about vaccines. And I must say all the illustration I use in the presentations are from our empirical material, are found in the group. So, the core of the global conspiracy theory concerning vaccine spread in COVID resistance is that global elites are plotting against humanity and building a new world order based on fascism. Through COVID-19 vaccinations, people are injected with nanotechnological parts connected to 5G, and these nanotechnological microchips will turn people into slaves who are completely dependent on secret elite groups. So illustration presents Bill Gates, who is frequently the main villain in these stories. And on his forehead he has a Freemason symbol, and you must agree that it looks like he's plotting against humanity in that particular illustration. So, there is also a conspiracy between governments across the globe and medical companies to hide the information about the dangers of vaccines and deceive people into thinking that vaccines are effective against COVID-19. And the admins of the channel disseminate information about various side effects of vaccines and represent them as dangerous for everyone, and particularly for children. And people who wish to be vaccinated are labeled as cattle. So the illustration in this slide, on this slide, it shows the director of Pfizer company, and the text says that by 2023, we will cut the world population, downsize the world population by 50%. So you guys, 4 weeks to go. Many people will perhaps be gone by even 3 weeks. So we have perhaps to be very worried right now. So, conspiracy narratives about vaccines in Russia. They have the same starting point as the global ones, so elites are plotting against normal people. And one of these topics is the discussion of Russia-produced vaccines like Sputnik V and other vaccines. And according to some of these posts, these vaccines were created to destroy the population of Russia. However, there are also some posts that question this, because if Russia would, why would Russia export deadly vaccines to friendly countries and not to the enemies like the USA? And on the other hand, in yet other posts, the fact that Sputnik is not approved in the West is used as proof that this vaccine is unsafe. So in that narrative, Sputnik V was developed as a part of competition between Russia and the West, and is therefore rushed and not a good vaccine to use. And so the illustration on the slide, it says that Sputnik V is the best goo in the world. It will even protect you against the strains of the virus that do not exist yet. So in sum, we find discursive inconsistency regarding the safety of Russian vaccines in our data. And in March 2022, the admins posted a lot of posts about vaccinations of refugees from Ukraine in the West, that unvaccinated people from Ukraine were actually forced to have deadly vaccines in receiving countries in Western Europe. The label restriction sums up rules regarding quarantine and rules regarding travel, face masks, self-tests, etc. All the things we're used to here as well. And like vaccines, restrictions are presented as part of the new world order based on fascism, again, and it's also built up by this conspiring group of global elites. And according to the posts in the group, restrictions are used by authorities to segregate people into wanted and unwanted citizens, much like the situation the Jews found themselves in during World War II. So the global elites, they are led by this, like aforementioned Bill Gates, Elon Musk, George Soros. They wish to control and reduce the population of the globe, and they cooperate with international corporations that create and distribute PCR tests, and face masks that insert alive nanoparticles directly into your brains. Yes, so these narratives, they present restrictions not only useless against COVID-19, but also dangerous in their own right. So in March 2021, in the posts on restrictions internally in Russia were mostly on face masks. And they included several videos about people who are civilians who refused to wear face masks in stores or on public transportations, and how they argued with police officers or with people who worked in the stores and used human rights and constitution as their argument. So it was unconstitutional to force people to wear masks. And so these people were presented as rebels and heroes, and they kind of, those sort of type of videos, they encouraged public disobedience in Russia. And in December, we found that most of restrictions were about, restrictions posts were about QR codes. And these QR codes, they were labeled as Ausweis. And admins also used other references to Nazism and to Hitler, like in the images and text about Russian authorities, politicians, and deputies. But interestingly, not on Putin. We didn't find him with the Hitler mustache in the group. So restrictions were presented as violations of human rights and the rights of Russian citizens in particular, and they were also connected to these global narratives about fascism and Nazism. And finally, in March 2021, the posts about restrictions were mainly about how they were lifted in Russia and abroad. And on the slide, we see the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, and he's saying that, basically he's saying in the post that you can come here, we will not humiliate you. So this is how they represented restrictions as humiliation of people. So being forced to wear masks and PCR tests at the borders were presented as humiliations. So the next narrative claims that the virus is fake. And it's again this secret group of elites, deep state, plotting against mankind again. But according to this theory, these elites have developed COVID-19 to annihilate part of the world population. So it's not really a virus, but chemical poisoning. And you see here a proof, like this photo was posted as a proof of that people are being poisoned by some chemical substances that is sprayed around on surfaces and added to our water. So basically, this implies that the disinfectants that were encouraged during the pandemic were actually the things that were poisoning us. So this is how they are plotting against humanity and poisoning it in broad daylight, basically. So in addition, countries that were presented as being under influence of World Health Organizations, and that there is a conspiracy between WHO, the media, the pharmaceutical companies, and those who sell COVID-19 related products. So fake virus is also a source of income, which is another reason why people are being deceived into believing in COVID-19. So finally, not finally, we have two more narratives to go, but so this we have categorized some posts as internal Russian agenda, and all of them were published in March 22, and several were about like local medicine developed by Russian pharmaceutical companies against COVID-19, and this was also used as proof that corrupt political and economic elites are earning money from COVID-19 by producing medicine for a fake virus that doesn't really exist. And there were some posts concerning the death of Zhirinovsky, and he was a controversial Russian politician, and you can see his photo on the screen. And according to himself, when he was alive, he was vaccinated 7 times with Russia-produced vaccines. But then he got COVID and ended up in a coma in February. And so there were a lot of discussions back and forth regarding his health. Like some said that he was doing better, some said he's in a coma, and then like some people announced his death and then took it back. So it was a lot of back and forth about that, and the channel also picked up on that. and discuss this. And yeah, so and the comment here, it just says that in your dreams, I will die in your dreams. But actually he did pass away in March this year. So yeah, and there was also one post that was dedicated to Vladimir Putin and how he was awarding medics for the fight with like televirus, the fake virus. Now I can say finally, the final narrative is about Russia being a besieged nation. And 4% of the posts were about that. Russia under attack of forces from abroad. And in this plotline, WHO is presented as the main other to Russia. However, Russian authorities, the government, and the Federal Service for Surveillance of Consumer Rights Protection and Human Well-being, called Rospotrebnadzor in Russian, they were under its influence. And the illustration shows the head of Rospotrebnadzor, Anna Popova, and how she was illustrated with devil horns and Hitler mustache. And another subplot claims that forces from abroad want Russians to be extinguished to take over Russian land. So I guess coronavirus is presented as a part of global takeover by, again, WHO, Bill Gates again, and other corrupt elites who support this takeover. And as on the illustration on the screen, you can see how these elites are represented. It's Angela Merkel, Jens Stoltenberg, Rockefeller, Freemasons, Donald Trump, and Mr. Burns from The Simpsons. And with this, I think I will give the word back to Ilya, who will sum up our main findings. Thank you.
Right. So, as Natalia said, I'll try to be brief. We only got 7 minutes left, I guess. So first of all, the number of these narratives that we've seen actually gives us a snapshot of what this particular community believes. This particular community is prone to conspiracy theories, right? That we know for a fact. But we would kind of tend to believe a few years ago that the Kremlin controls the media narratives, that the Kremlin has the control over propaganda and spreads it successfully, controls the country. From what we see in this data, that is not true. So there is a huge diversity of all sorts of narratives, and very few of these narratives are actually driven by the state-run propaganda. So we see the same things happening now. The Levada Center poll about the kind of the reasons why Russia is failing in the war in Ukraine also prove that. Kind of ordinary people, when they asked about the reasons for the operation in for the fails in the operation in Ukraine, they say very kind of genuine things and not driven by propaganda. Same here. We see Fortress Russia and kind of besieged nation that has very few posts and very kind of minor support of the population of this particular channel, right? Then clearly we see that that creates tension for the authorities on all sorts of levels, because we saw posts about the protests in the Duma during the hearings of this kind of travel bans for unvaccinated, where the communists were basically protesting against QR fascism imposed by the authorities. So that created cracks in the elite, right? So potentially that would have created tensions and questioned the control of the political elites, something that the Kremlin was working hard to have for more than 20 years. And we also see that the source of channels like COVID-19 resistance and the digital media, they actually, yes, they are part of the control of the population. We see how Kremlin spreads this network of networks of Telegram channels to muddy the waters, to promote friendly narratives. But at the same time, these technologies do have the potential to aggregate anti-government sentiment and actually push it further. So there is a chance for that kind of crack in the regime. Now, where is the limitation to state propaganda? Again, we argue here that certainly there is a successfully promoted narratives. Again, if we talk about the Ukrainian the war, about kind of the anti-Ukrainian sentiments, they are successful in promoting them because these things are so far from ordinary Russians. Ordinary Russians have no idea how Ukrainians live. They have no clue about politics, society. They get information from the trusted sources by the government and they trust them. But when propaganda tries to reach their personal lives or the environment they understand the best, this is where propaganda fails. This is where people's critical assessment of reality and their knowledge of reality and their concerns about their well-being, the well-being of their children, the well-being of their families, that's the shield from the state propaganda. So choosing between the personal freedoms, personal safety and sort of ideas on protecting the nation from COVID-19, people will choose will choose individual freedoms. Then, another interesting thing. For many years, the Kremlin was trying to push this narrative about the Second World War, the winners in the Second World War, use the memory of the Second World War as the binding tool for the nation, one of the central instruments for the nation building. And gradually we've seen that public intellectuals and authorities monopolized the language and monopolized in a way the memory of Second World War, including all the markers, like where's the Nazis, fascists, etc. Here we see that the community is actually kidnapping those narratives about the Nazis, the fascists, and they start using them against the authorities. So now it's Popova, now it's governments, Mishustin, who are fascists, who are trying to impose Ausweis, another word from the highly politicized language of the Second World War used in the Soviet propaganda. So here it is Ausweis that is imposed by the government, which is quite interesting because it shows that no matter how strong the grip on historical memory in Russia is, individuals will find a way to steal it, to respond to the grievances that they have as individuals. And another thing is, we see that global conspiracy theories about the global corrupt elite penetrate the Russian digital space and quickly are being adopted. We see how quickly the posts in Spanish, in Chinese, in English are being translated by the volunteers within this network and immediately posted for the illumination, for education of those interested in protecting their own health. And we see that, yes, there is a global elite like Bill Gates or Rockefeller seen as main conspirators against the all good people who do not want to buy into the COVID-19, threats, but it's also the local elite, no matter who they are. Either the head of the Ministry of Health or the head of the major institution that developed Sputnik V or Zhirinovsky again, they are seen as corrupt. Again, it is also peculiar that we almost haven't seen Vladimir Putin in these discussions. Again, one of the major kind of observations about Russian political regime and Russian propaganda, Putin is everywhere, right? Putin is on calendars, Putin is on the TV, he's always number one in all the news programs. So Putin, it's a highly personalized regime, right? So you would have thought that Putin would be there, right? So that here, we almost don't see him, 4%, right? Kind of all the posts in, in 3 months that we've looked at. So it's not much of Putin there. And he's either not really kind of positive, it's rather neutral. So he's either non-existent or he's simply not there. So we can say that it's either kind of individuals or members of this network, they're not interested in him at all, so he's not in their lives, he's somewhere there, it's a divine creature in a way. Or we might also argue that people are afraid to criticize him, because that would attract unnecessary attention of the law enforcement services. So this point can be, can be discussed further. But this is interesting because it was also Putin's individual strategy to protect his image. He was never announcing any kind of measures that would limit the freedoms of individuals in Russia. He never announced lockdowns. He never said when and what he used as a jab, and he never wanted to have his image associated with very unpopular measures. The same thing as he does now. He never announces any bad, negative things. He always outsources them, either to the MFA or to the MOD. So we can say, to conclude, that Telegram, despite all the attempts to put it under control, is still very much unaffected to the promotion of disinformation, and disinformation of all sorts of stuff. Again, if you look at this channel today, it's actually, curiously enough, the channel was renamed in April this year, from COVID-19 resistance to the conspiracy theory. So now it's called conspiracy theory. It has lost subscribers, but now the channel switched completely to the criticism of the Russian war in Ukraine, and the main argument of the post now that it's a brotherly war instigated by the Jews. Now it's an anti-Semitic channel. Purely anti-Semitic conspiracy theories there. And they're not regulated, right? So you can share this content. Now, we can say that COVID-19 protests really challenged the way what the Kremlin wanted to sell to the society, how the Kremlin wanted to frame the pandemic and promote its ideas. The only free media, the media that was actually driven by grassroots communities, challenged it, and we saw so many footage of protests, of videos and photos from across Russia, but also from across the world. And the framing of those posts was, look, people in Germany are protesting, look, people in Hungary are protesting, look what the Americans are doing. And it was not like, oh, those bloody Americans are doing that. On the contrary, it was, look, they're fighting for their freedoms. And imagine it in the country that's been of the authoritarian state for 22 years. So that was something that probably Kremlin was not expected to have. And when the war started, we remember that it happened, in a way, in many ways, out of blue for many people. Many people were shocked. So the Kremlin didn't really bother about creating a large kind of union in support inside the Russian society. So it came as a surprise. The war came as a surprise for many people in Russia. And that's why we saw how Kremlin really trying to struggle to find arguments for the invasion. Why we are there, why we are doing that. And the biolabs conspiracy theory was one of the ways to actually explain why we were there. Also, I would argue that that conspiracy theory was promoted by Lavrov himself, by the Ministry of Defense, by the major politicians and the Russian state media, just to attract possible anti-vaxxers on the side of the Kremlin in their support of the Ukrainian war. But as we see in this community, that didn't work. There were zero endorsements of this conspiracy theory. And it would have seemed that, well, I mean, that's a very relevant conspiracy theory to discuss about. And this is a piece of disinformation that constantly pops up these days in the discussions with ordinary Russians, right? So that conspiracy theory did not disappear, but it was not endorsed. And that can be argued that it's about the distrust that the community of subscribers and admins of this channel has towards the elite, towards the ruling elite in Russia and the global elite in particular. And in many ways, that channel demonstrates that if we are trying to find and sense the limitations of propaganda, the limitation of what can and what cannot be promoted in Russia, this channel shows where these limitations. Thank you. Shall we sit here?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Oops.
Is that me?
I
Is that
think
me?
it's you, Natalia.
It's me, no?
No, I don't know. One of us.
It's one of us. Okay, so we will first of all thank you for your presentation here, and we'll open up the floor for questions and comments. But I would like to take the opportunity to ask a question myself. I partly know the answer, but I think it's useful for the audience. Okay, to hear more about this, you say on the final slide that the study demonstrates the limits of the effectiveness of the Kremlin's propaganda, and then the results that you have presented here, they're all from one Telegram channel. So could you say something about whether or not this channel is representative of a wider community?
Do you want to?
No. I want that.
No, well, we've heard about this limitation, and we have decided that we need to look at similar channels. So we also chose 5 Telegram channels that were rather popular, with also several dozen of thousands subscribers, and we've also looked at the same month to see whether the results from COVID-19 resistance are representative, and we've seen pretty much the same picture.
So they are representative.
Yes,
of,
they are
of
very
the
much
wider
representative.
community. Yes.
Lovely.
We'll use the microphone in the interest of our online audience. So start there, and then it was.
Thank you very much for Jakub Godzimirski from this institute. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I would like to pick up on the last point you mentioned, and you have also discussed the effectiveness of the Russian state propaganda. And as far as I understand, the main conclusion is that the propaganda works until it somehow collides with the personal experience. To what extent this conclusion can also be something that we need to discuss in the context of the Russian propaganda and the war in Ukraine, because we know that the partial mobilization has had impact on the lives of at least 300,000 of Russian families. To what extent this is something that may also change the mood in the more broader context, because we know that the Russian state has invested a lot of effort and money into making Russians believe that the war is just and necessary, while this personal experience of people being forced to take to take part in the war is something that somehow undermines this claim. So to what extent this lesson from this project could also be translated into something more general?
Thank you. Who wants to go first?
You can start, and I can.
All right. That's a good question, and that's a very relevant one. I would say that, first of all, the war in Ukraine poses a much bigger challenge, I would say, than the COVID-19. First of all, having a vaccine and sending a person to the front line it's quite a different scale of threat. And once COVID can be perceived as an imagined threat, being killed at the front line is a very real threat. Then the second element to that sort of picture is that we see gradually the growing dissatisfaction, growing protest. Mothers are protesting, they're posting online, they address to Putin, can you please return our sons, it's the only son, can you return it to me, blah, blah, blah. So we see that is happening. It's not a large scale, but there's a third element, right? What were the consequences for protesting or recording a video on Telegram about the dissatisfaction with Zhirinovsky or Popova or whoever? The consequences would have been really minor. Now the society is really turning into, kind of slowly moving to totalitarianism, right? And every word can be punished. So the stakes are much higher than they were during the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's why the protests, let's say these limitations of propaganda, can be seen, they will be emerging, I believe. I might be wrong, but as a scholar, social scientist scholar, I sort of believe that it will be much more emergent. But there's another element that differentiates what COVID-19 presented and what the war in Ukraine presents. In the case of COVID-19 is the personal health and well-being. Something that the government was also promoting, all these traditional values, the future of our children, that was part of the narrative of the conservative turn, kind of promoted by the Kremlin from the early 2010s. At the same time, the war in Ukraine and how it's framed for many ordinary Russians, it is also a matter of national, kind of part of the nation building, let's say, community building. It is about the memory of the Second World War, it's about the defense of Russia from the West, it's defense of Russia from the so-called gay Europa and all these kind of narratives. So some of these values resonate among these target groups that are subscribers of the channel, right? So for them, they would sound much more genuine than any statements that the Kremlin bureaucrats were making during the COVID-19 pandemic. So here, the shield that the government created is much thicker because the government was invested very much in building the shield. The government was not prepared to deal with that, right? But even that shield can get thinner.
Add something, Natalia, or should we move forward?
I had just a small minor thing about what you mentioned with mothers, you have mothers talking to Putin through social media, but then he takes that agenda and creates like a meeting with like fake mothers, or like they are real mothers, I guess, but not the grassroots movements that are mothers. So this is how like the propaganda machine responds to this demand, you know. So it adapts to the situation. So that was like my side comment.
Yeah.
Then it's Mikael and then Mariam. So first.
Yeah, so I have a question and then a reflection that adds on to what Helge was saying. And the question is regarding the American biolabs conspiracy theory, because if you were saying that people didn't buy it, they bought it in Ukraine, and they bought it in Ukraine before the war or the expanded war started to a very high extent, because it was being pushed by the pro-Russian media, the local pro-Russian media that were supported by Viktor Medvedchuk. I know this for a fact because I actually investigated this particular question myself. I mean, we're talking about lots, a quarter that will really buy it, a quarter of the population of Mariupol will accept the theory as it is, and then many are sort of, well, I don't know. So why would the Ukrainian, sort of say, markets buy this conspiracy theory that actually is about labs in Ukraine, but not the Russian market? And then when it comes to adding on to what Helge was saying about the representativeness of this study, and I'm sure that you're aware of it, but my impression is that you're targeting a particular demographic. Telegram users. And this also referring to a little investigation I did in Mariupol, is that when you look into the next demographic, slightly older groups, they don't use Telegram, but they use Viber chat groups and WhatsApp chat groups. And they have a slightly different dynamic because they're smaller, but at the same time, they're more trust-based. And so even though the conspiracy theories circulate more locally there, they circulate with a degree of trust that's more significant. And what happened in Mariupol, for example, is that many of these groups that are, for example, school class-based, mothers and maybe fathers in some cases of children in some class, well, they managed to get a teacher removed because he didn't vaccinate himself. Oh, sorry, he did vaccinate himself.
Okay.
Not didn't, did. And that is a very, very dangerous thing.
Yes. Data selection. Always an issue in research. Yeah, sure. Yeah. If we would have chosen other groups, perhaps we would have found, like other media channels and other demographics, perhaps we would find something different. But for our design, we looked at those. How many groups did you look into for your
5 and COVID-19 resistance.
5 other? Yes. So I think those are different type of issues. I don't know.
Could you say something about advantages, disadvantages of Telegram versus the other groups that were mentioned here?
Well, first, sorry.
Yeah, no, sure.
First of all, getting into WhatsApp and Viber is almost impossible if you are not invited by someone else. So it's like basically going into this community and staying with them, getting their trust. So let's face it, it's almost impossible to do, right? Especially in the context of the war, right? So getting into those, I agree, and that's probably a very prospective avenue for research, these closed groups, but it's just almost impossible to do. So we've looked at the open space, open public space, the one that is not being censored, neither by the authorities nor by the owners. As for the demographic, hard to say. I would say that the audience is much more diverse than we seem to imagine. Well, certainly we won't have people of the age of 65, 70, 75 using Telegram, but probably we're going to have around, let's say, 18 to 45 for sure, because we've seen all sorts of posts by young mothers, by fathers, by families. So kind of this is the kind of the core. Probably that is in many ways the most prospective audience for possible protest, participation in protest, because they have something to lose. These are kind of the audiences that have something to lose. But yeah, I mean, we can say that probably in WhatsApp groups, in the closed communities, we would have found much more support to Putin, probably. But at the moment, I don't think that, especially if we compare it to, again, I had this slide in the previous version. So one of the channels was like 50-something thousand, and then another channel was like 39,000. They were all different, so they were not connected with each other. And these were channels set up by independent, for example, Независимая ассоциация врачей, that had a lot of criticism, that had a lot of problems with the law during the pandemic for their position on COVID and the way how vaccination was going, and the criticism of COVID-19 vaccine. So these guys are genuine, and they are very different. We can agree that probably it would be the same kind of folks sitting on channels just basically confirming their biases. I would agree with that, yep.
Yeah, just like Telegram is also, after the war, it has become the most popular, most widely used social media in Russia. It has taken over from
Contact.
and WhatsApp, because people are like running to Telegram because of all this new regulations on censorship and everything. So, but we didn't answer the one about biolabs.
No, exactly.
And Ukraine. Yeah, that's why.
Go ahead.
No, I was just thinking, like, if we, because now your findings are, I guess, from talking to people doing another type of field work, is also how a survey, yeah, because like how comparative is our data really with yours? Maybe if we had done another type of project, we would see that some people in Russia do believe in some communities do believe in this biolabs in Ukraine stories, probably, and they probably do, but not the community we were exploring. And that's what we mean by the limits of the propaganda, that there are some spaces that it doesn't go.
But also, I think it, in a way, it could be related to the divide, again, a very artificial one, between Eastern Ukraine and Western Ukraine. So probably people in Mariupol would be, again, you know better. I have no idea about Ukraine, but probably that would be more or less overlapping audiences that would believe in biolabs and shared criticism and concern about the authorities, and speculated about the kind of possible Western conspiracy against Ukraine and Russia.
Okay, let's move to the next question.
You really fascinating empirical findings. Thank you for sharing it with us. I agree with WhatsApp being very interesting field, but I agree with Ilya as well, because it's almost impossible field to research, and there are so many ethicals and GDPR considerations to be taken into account. My question is, so your conclusion is that the conspiracy theory that about the biolabs and the justification of the biolabs in Ukraine as a means of invasion didn't find root in the society, but then subsequently after March and during the other month, we've seen that other conspiracy theories have been very rooted in the society. So the Nazis in Kiev and other stuff. So it would be interesting to know your perspective on why is the Russian society so receptive for conspiracy theories in general. So you have the conspiracy theories coming from the grassroots, and then you have conspiracy theories coming from the government. And still, on some level or another, the society is quite receptive to them. Why do you think that is?
Okay, it's a very long answer, but I'll try to put it in several paragraphs. So, because there was this the way how the Soviet state was dismantled and the aftershocks of the neoliberal reforms, that created a lot of skepticism about the ruling elite, right? So who benefited from the reforms and who lost, right? So conspiracy theories are always the ways of expression of kind of negative attitudes in society. So if people suffer, if people are not happy about something, if people feel they are disadvantaged, they will be expressing that in the form of conspiracy theories. And Telegram and user-generated content is very much the way to express those concerns. That's kind of first factor. Second factor, the Russian state, starting from 2003 roughly, was very much interested in promoting all sorts of conspiracy theories as the way to A, to explain its policies, and B, to actually promote social divisions inside the Russian society to actually keep the majority under control. And C, if you have a natural distrust of the elite, and then if you are consuming some sort of content, either from the TV or from social media, then probably you will find, and if you are naturally traumatized by, let's say, the way how the state manages things, you're going to find your community, your type of conspiracy theories that will probably be either adopted or kidnapped by some of the pseudo-intellectuals that would be working on the payroll of the Kremlin. And we see that, again, the Kremlin invested a lot in diversifying these intellectual environments, kind of supporting all sorts of critics of the regime by actually saying, look, the prime minister is bad, but Putin is good. He's doing the right thing for us, right? And then, you know, and they all work they all foster different fronts, right? So if you found your guy, if you found the channel, right, and you say, oh, I think I trust this channel, I'm going to be reading this channel every day, right? The way how the propaganda machine was kind of designed, especially with the social media, this is such an easy way for kind of all sorts of conspiracy theories to actually get to users, to Russian citizens.
Daniela is next, and then Tora.
Hi, my name is Daniela. I'm a research assistant here at NUPI. And thank you so very much for a very interesting presentation. I have a couple of questions. So the first one is kind of related to what you previously mentioned about there being this left-wing, right-wing division in the West, but during the corona pandemic they were united in spreading conspiracy theories, although in different shapes and forms. In Russia, maybe it's difficult to talk about left-wing, right-wing in the same way, but what I observed was that while many regular Russians were opposing the measures and the vaccine itself, especially oppositional figures and figures that usually are being framed in a negative way in Russia actually promoted people or asked people to take the vaccine or took the vaccine themselves and posted on Instagram and try to promote a positive picture of all of these measures. And it's just interesting how these roles kind of shifted during the corona pandemic in Russia. So I was just wondering whether you saw any mentioning of these kinds of divides or roles on the channels. And then my second question is related to deep state and Russia. Do you think that this narrative was a highly context-specific narrative, or do you also see it today in the light of the Ukraine war? Because I mean, there could potentially, like in theory, be room to for people to explore this conspiracy theory in these times. But have you seen any signs of this?
I'll take the second one.
Yeah, I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yes, Daniela, could you specify which people from the
Opposition.
which opposition people? Yeah, give
for
me some
instance,
examples.
I saw Alyona Popova. She did that. The climate activists like Arshak Makichan, for instance. I saw the feminist movement in St. Petersburg also promote the vaccine, just to mention a few.
Yeah, thank you so much. So when looking at the data, we found a lot of posts about like actors, mentioning several, like, oh, this one, another one bites the dust, kind of like comments. So they were all people who were promoting vaccines in Russian space, were presented in a negative light, like and either as being like cattle or as being faking vaccines, because they were like have several videos about, oh look, he's like fake, like if you can see that he's not really sticking the needle into his arm, it's really like just a fake, like a pen. So basically, but none of the people vaccinated were presented in positive light at all. And I did not find any figures, like any pronounced members of opposition either being vaccinating or promoting vaccines. So more like those popular cultural people, I would say.
But it would probably be a speculation. But you know, when Putin is not there in the mask, you know, you will clearly, if you want to contrast yourself to Putin, you will actually put the mask, right? So, and it's it's a different kind of audience, people who kind of realize the danger of the disease and actually decided to A, vaccinate, and B, actually wear a mask in public spaces. So in many ways that was, again, that's a pure speculation, but in a way it was part of the political position. If the authorities behave one way, I'm going to behave another way. As for the deep state conspiracy theory, you know that it came from Turkey, right? So kind of the conspiracy theory about deep state originates in Turkey in the 1970s. So that was kind of part of the discourse about the opposition within the states related to kind of pro-democratic forces. And then kind of deep state conspiracy theories was also a huge driver of political debates within Turkey from 70s onwards. And then in the late 2000s, it was actually transferred to America. And in the United States, that's how the world actually learned about that. There's a great article by my colleague about that, about the transfer of this conspiracy theory. So in the States, the deep state conspiracy theory basically responded to the kind of natural concern about the power of bureaucracy. So it is about, okay, we've got constant changes of presidents from Democratic to the Republican, but how about bureaucracy? Are we swapping bureaucrats too? And in fact, no, we don't, right? It's the same bureaucracy. They just, the guy was, I was at the panel with the head of the Radio Free Europe, Jamie Fly, I think. And he's a Republican. So he started his job as a Republican, but then he kind of, now under the Democratic administration, he's still head of the Russian Radio Free Europe. So it's a kind of, it's a reflection upon how the political system works. So they hold this deep state conspiracy theory in the US. But then in Russia, it's a completely different story. In Russia, the deep state conspiracy theory doesn't fly. It's not used. It's used, the Surkov tried to kind of change it into the glubinny narod, kind of deep people, but that actually, it doesn't make sense. I mean, what sort of people is that, right? What are you talking about? In a way, it's kind of, it lost its conspiratorial narrative, the one that Trump's usage of the deep state conspiracy theories was.
Okay, I just want to remind the online audience that it's possible to post questions in the chat, but next one out here is Tora.
Tora Nachta, I'm also here from Nupi. My questions have mainly been answered by Mariam's question, but I can comment. I was surprised that you said that the biolab stuff didn't resonate. I think that's very interesting, and I think it also speaks to maybe case selection and those things that you've discussed, because I've been wondering, when you look at Russian official discourse from the last decade, this is something that keeps popping up in strange places, this idea that there's collection of genetic material and you know, development of targeted bioweapons and stuff like that. So it does resonate in a sense with something that is there. So I was wondering if maybe you could, you know, reflect on that, or if you know something about where that comes from, what that constitutes.
Yes, when you started your question, I've been thinking in very conspiratorial terms, because I've been thinking, all right, I mean, if Putin is really keen on this whole kind of body politics conspiracy theories about genetic material, because he's the one who actually started mentioning it a few years ago at the meeting with human rights activists, that some foreign scientists are collecting biological material in Russia and sort of preparing some kind of weapon to kill specifically Russians, right? I would, like, in a conspiratorial term, I would argue probably it was invented to convince him too that what he's doing is right. Because the way how, as we understand how the top level of the Kremlin operates, it is about reports, like good old papers that try to convince the leader that, you know, he's doing everything right, or this is the stuff that needs to be done. And what we know from the closest associates, like Kovalchuk, for example, Mikhail Kovalchuk is a very big fan of all sorts of biological, genetical conspiracy theories. So, and if that guy is like a close friend and associate that he confirmed just a couple of days ago on the 1st of December, with all sorts of rubbish that he said at the meeting with the students and with young researchers. So we could probably speculate again that the reason why biolabs popped up in the context of the war in Ukraine was not only to actually get those anti-vaxxers on the side of the Kremlin, but also to convince Vladimir Putin that, you know, it's actually there is some serious threat. But again, it's like kind of my funnily speculation on that. I fully admit that.
Want to come in on that?
Yeah, just but this biolabs conspiracy theory was also circulating about COVID-19, but not in Ukraine. I guess there were like it was part of the general global conspiracy theories about the origin of COVID-19. But then after the start of the war, it kind of migrated to Ukraine, and that's where the biolab was based.
But actually, it was also present earlier in Georgia.
In Georgia?
In Georgia. And in Ukraine. But I think first it was Georgia, and then it moved to Ukraine, because Georgia was also kind of the biggest enemy after 2008. So yeah, that's a migrating narrative.
Any final questions? One from you, Tomta?
I can ask a question. Towards the end, you mentioned something about how the group transformed into an anti-Semitic conspiratorial group after the invasion. And I was wondering if you can say something about this, why out of the big universe of conspiracy theories, why anti-Semitism was chosen, and whether it has a longer history in Russian conspiracy thinking.
Answer the long conspiracy thinking, but I can just mention that the group, after, I guess, okay, if we're thinking of the group as a source of income for the admin because of commercials, he kind of rebranded the group because when the war started, then everyone forgot about COVID, and here in Norway as well. So everyone forgot about COVID, but he still needed to keep the group going, I guess. So he quickly turned the agenda towards, I guess, the war, and then changed the name of the group in April, like Ilya mentioned. And also the number of the members of this group dropped by, I guess, 30,000 approximately. It's about in 90,000 right now, but still a very popular group. But why they chose to present those narratives in that way, that perhaps Ilya can say something about.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at this as a business venture for the founder, you need to, and he was promoting quite some advertisers, like some products relevant for this community. Staying away from Ukraine war was virtually impossible. And I would disagree that he acted fast. I would say that he acted slow, because he changed the name in April, like weeks after the start of the invasion. And the content, okay, that's a Russian-speaking Telegram channel that is read by Ukrainians, Moldovans, Kazakhs, Georgians, I mean, Russian speakers. So staying away or taking the side would probably be too risky. And as we see from the kind of global studies of COVID-19 related conspiracy theories, the anti-Jewish element was always present there. And tapping into this rich culture of global conspiracy theories and adding the anti-Semitic element to that, in many ways it's a safe bet. Probably he isn't anti-Semitic himself. We know that the guy from Ukraine, right? So probably for him, taking the side of Russia in this conflict would have been harder too. But we don't have access to him. We only have one interview that was conducted at the start of the channel, when the channel had a few hundred, was it like 30,000 users, 30,000
yeah,
users,
yes.
And so we don't have access to him. I would love to talk to him now, but again, it's just what we see from the channel. Again, it's a safe bet, I would say.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I just also noticed recently after the war, I started posting this. You will not encourage divides. Yes, divides in this group. Do not use to encourage, but like the Jews are okay to encourage divides against the elites and everything, but not like between Ukrainians and Russians. Actually.
Totally, but it also kind of reflects in many ways that one of these Putin's nation-building narratives. It's kind of friendship of the peoples, right? So it's like, oh yes, we are all united, and it's a brotherly country, brotherly love. It's all about Ukrainians and Russians being the same nation, but these are these kind of nasty guys who are trying to divide us. And yeah, eventually they just slipped into the global conspiracy, global kind of conspirators, and then it was just a one tiny step to anti-Semitism.
I think we have to end there, even if there are more questions, I see. But if you are interested in learning more about conspiracy theories in Russia, well, here today we have been talking about the grassroots aspect, but Ilya's day is not over yet. He will give a presentation at the University of Oslo at 4:15, where he will focus more on the top-down spread of conspiracy theories, how the Kremlin has pushed conspiracy theories as a legitimizing tool and as a policy tool. So you're all welcome to join us there as well at 4:15 at Sofus Bugge, Seminar Room 1. And as for the topic that has been presented here, it's a work in progress, but it will hopefully be an article out sometime next year. Yes, so you can also learn more about the final results there. So stay tuned. But for now, thank you very much for attending this seminar, and hope to see you here at NUPI or at the university later today at another occasion. Thank you.
Thank you.